Every day, people like you and me witness paranormal activity. Many people suffer alone, afraid of telling their stories. Their encounters remain locked away, like skeletons tapping lightly on a closet door. Join me, Blake Lewis, as we peel back the veil of our reality, searching through silence. Good evening, children of the night. Another month swept away like dust in the wind to fade into our memories of once was and remember whens, as time continues to tick by with each grain of sand that falls victim to gravity's relentless onslaught. It's the quickening. We should all feel grateful to wake another day, even with this reality slowly receding back into the darkness, striving to break our determination at every twist and turn as it drags us along, carving our fingers through the thick mud. We all fight to stay alive. Just breathe. Every new day is a test and a testament to our accomplishments and how far we have all come. Tonight, we place our survival stories aside and turn our attention towards one of the darker locations this realm has to offer. Tonight, we stride in the footsteps of a curious soul named Julian, who allowed his curiosity to drag him far too close to the gates of hell. Tonight, we all play a little game of follow the leader, as we find ourselves face to face with Haley's monster. I would hear a lot of stories growing up about encounters people would have in the woods around where I lived when I was a child. People reporting animals missing, and even friends of mine losing animals in the woods around the pit. Everyone knew something wasn't right about that place, but no one dared to venture too far in unless they had a death wish. I remember a couple of years prior to my encounter, a friend of mine, Henry, lost his Labrador, Haley. The whole town loved that dog. So much so that everyone went on a searching spree for her for days when she ran off into the woods behind the pit. A couple of town folk who were cut from a braver cloth ventured further into the woods to see if they could find her. They found her all right. Just not all of her. Henry was never the same after that night. Neither was the town. Sightings of the creature began to escalate, and people began to refer to the creature as Haley's monster. Henry stopped coming out altogether when we would all gather together and play manhunt around the areas where the tree line receded into the pit, because that's where Most of the hunters' sightings and experiences took place. Nothing bad had ever happened to us while we played, unless someone ventured too far into the darkness. That's when kids would hear voices in the distance, whispers calling for them by name, or so they would claim. I didn't have any stories to tell up until that point, because it was far too frightening of a thought for me to even travel back into that area. Kids would dare one another to travel deeper into the pit than the last, with sharpened sticks that had torn off pieces of cloth tied to the tops like makeshift flags. Children would cautiously venture into the unknown region, all in an effort of stabbing their flag past the last flag that penetrated furthest into the cursed land as proof of one's bravery. It was a fool's errand to me. I had nothing to prove. As long as we stayed around the front of the pit, we were capable of enjoying ourselves at night. Our parents would freak out, of course, but who could blame them? They were all constantly afraid of losing children to whatever it was that lurked in those cursed woods. Some families became so shaken that they moved away over time, but most were forced to stay. It was cheap, affordable housing, and everyone was struggling to make financial ends meet. Most of us were trapped there, or at least it felt that way. It was one of the coldest fall seasons I remember growing up. It could quite possibly be that the events in that town left my memories frozen in fear for the situation I stumbled into. I started a new job at the local tavern, bussing tables, and spent most of my afternoons leading up until nightfall dealing with the cleanup work from hungry residents that would flood in and out all day. We were a small town, so there wasn't much going on outside of the tavern when it came to places that people could gather, and because of that, I found myself smack in the middle of everyone's conversations, constantly hearing ghost stories and tales of strange encounters being thrown about by all of the local hunters and fishermen who would swear by the likes of God that their stories were all true, and witnessed other folk laugh all of their tales off as fiction, with rebuttals claiming that they were hearing coyotes, that Haley's monster was most likely a bear attack. Some people even claimed that most of the stories were due to brain fatigue from being out in the wilderness for too long without proper nourishment. I didn't know what to believe, though. I just enjoyed allowing my imagination to drift as I catered to all of the residents who would stop in for a bite to eat. There was one local, though, that everyone had respect for. Charlie Harding. Every evening, Charlie would come in around 5 o'clock and sit in the same booth at the far corner of the tavern. He was a frail old man, very dingy, and always looked like he lived out in the woods itself. Everyone would hush up when he arrived, and for good reason. I was told from one of the local fishermen that Charlie was hunting out in the woods with his son Jacob one night, and they strayed further out past the pit than they should have, and Charlie went missing for 3 days. When Charlie returned, he was completely dazed and soaked in blood. The hunter that found him went into a panic and rushed Charlie to the medic. They couldn't find a scratch on him. The blood that was soaked through Charlie's clothes was Jacob's. The local authorities went on a 3-day manhunt for the boy, but his body was never found. Charlie told the authorities of their encounter with a large, skinny, tree-like being with the head of a rotten deer that grabbed his son in front of his face and tore Jacob's head from his shoulders. Charlie recalled fleeing from the location and not being able to try and save his son because fright took over his body and he stumbled off to save his own life. A first-hand survival account of Haley's monster. They hooked him up to a polygraph and everything, but his story remained true. No one talks to Charlie about that incident, so when he arrives, the nights tended to quiet down at the tavern. We weren't stupid. We knew something wasn't right in that location, but we all would try so hard to live amongst the entity that inhabits that region, even if we had to lie to ourselves to make life feel normal. My shift ended around 5:30 every night, so I would tend to watch Charlie drink his evening coffee, which I never understood. Why the hell would he drink so much damn coffee at night? Did the loss of his son damage his biological clock? I would always make a reference to it, and whoever was the server during night shift would shrug it off. Not that night, though. Betty was bringing Charlie his coffees that night, and she was a ball buster. She drove her elbow into my shoulder blade into the direction of Charlie's table and immediately fired a snark response at me. "Why don't you go ask him, honey?" As she giggled from me slightly staggering, I gave her a snarky facial response and looked back toward Charlie's table to see him smiling at me with a stagnant grin from ear to ear. It scared the hell out of me, and I had nervously panicked, turning the other way and darting toward the order window, trying to play it off like I was hard at work. But he just kept smiling at me. No sounds, no blinking. It was so unnerving. Finally, Betty took notice of Charlie's odd behavior and returned to his table and asked if he would like another cup of coffee. Charlie turned toward Betty, and his grin faded to a lost, depressed expression. "No, I wouldn't want to damage my biological clock any further, would I?" He placed his money on the table and rose to his feet. "You've been coming here for 6 years now. You know your money's no good here, Mr. Harding." He grabbed his money off of the table and peered into Betty's eyes. "I'm sick of your pity." He turned toward the door and slowly exited the tavern. Betty glanced at me. How strange was that? I answered the only way I knew how to. Yeah. I watched him walk away for a couple of minutes, wondering where he was on to, but there were 5 minutes of my shift left, so I bolted into action, cleaning my entire station and restocking everything so I wouldn't get chewed out from the late night busser, Hank. He was scheduled as my relief. I grabbed my bus pan, walked over to the table Charlie had been sitting, and noticed there was a 50-cent piece resting on the cushion where Charlie had been moments prior. When I picked up the piece, it reflected in the halogen lights above my head. It brought my thought process to a halt. I looked around, making sure that no one was around, then slid the coin into my pocket. I was in a rush to leave the tavern, especially that night, because most of my friends were meeting up for another game of manhunt. I had to get back to my house fast to grab my flashlight and throw on a darker set of clothes, so I wouldn't be seen as easily in the blanket of darkness provided by the towering trees of the forest. I wasn't going to go originally, but caught wind from one of my friends, Tony, that Sherry was attending the gathering that night. Sherry was my crush back then. Hell, she was everyone's crush back then. But the worst part is she knew it. I don't know why, but I felt strange and immediately sensed something wasn't right when I left the tavern. I felt strange in my skin, and I knew I was being watched. So I started to walk faster while scanning the woods around me as I made my way home. The road was so dark, with the occasional street lamp illuminating the street below every 60 feet or so. It was difficult to see too far ahead, and every time I got closer to the next lamp, my eyes began to dilate, making it more difficult to discern any potential threat around the tree line while traveling back into the darkness. I was about halfway home when I noticed the silhouette of a man standing under the next street lamp ahead. The light was far duller than the other lamps and was violently fluttering as if it was having a major circuitry issue. My blood ran cold. I tried to address the man, but he wasn't responding to any of my questions. "Are you okay, sir?" The silhouette made no attempt to answer me back. "Sir." The figure just stood there silently, and by the time I was close enough to see more detail, I could tell that the man was staring at me. "Hey man, I'm talking to you." As I advanced toward the stranger, I began to visibly notice the lifeless facial expression on his face and realized it was Charlie. "Damn it, Charlie! You scared the shit out of me. What the hell are you doing out here?" He continued to stay silent, staring at me with the saddest expression on his face as it randomly appeared in the flickering pulses of broken light. Not hearing any response, I decided it would be best to continue to mind my own path and remove myself from the strange situation altogether. "Take it easy, Charlie," I whispered, slowly walking onward. I turned my back up the road and picked up my pace while attempting to not show any fear, But as I got about 10 feet ahead, I heard Charlie's feet begin to scuffle in my direction. When I glanced back, I noticed Charlie attempted to follow me as I continued to walk. I turned around to confront him, and he immediately stopped walking and remained awkwardly silent. "What the hell is your problem?" I asked him, with as much inflection as I could muster. "Get the hell out of here, man. I'm warning you." He stood there momentarily, eyeing me up and down with a look of pure hatred on his face, then looked off into the woods a couple of times, turned his body while continuing to stare at me, and walked directly into the forest without an ounce of trepidation in his step. I stood there, heavy breathing, listening as he worked his way through distant shrubs, cracking branches as he gained a good distance from me. Once I couldn't hear him any longer, I darted off in the direction of my house as fast as I could to make up for the lost time, and tried to leave the strange encounter behind me in my mind. By the time I reached my house, daylight was a distant memory. I stormed into my bedroom, locked my door, turned on my television, changed my clothing, and quickly snuck out of my window so my mother didn't know I was out after dusk. I grabbed my BMX and set off. When I reached the outskirts of the pit, it was clear to me that our game had already begun without me, so I rode down to the hill, hopped off of my seat while it was still moving, and ghost rode my bike into a pile of the other bikes that laid in the mangled mess just before the entrance. Todd, who was my least favorite person out of the entire squad, turned on his flashlight and shot the beam directly into my eyes, blinding my sight momentarily. "You're out, shithead," he said in a condescending tone. "Get out of here. I just got here, bro. At least give me some time to..." "Nope. You're out, asshat, and no amount of talking is going to get you out of that shit. Go sit your ass by the bikes that you obliterated with your cheap-ass Huffy when you rode in. Late, I might add." "Take it easy, Todd," a soft voice from the tree line responded to the argument between us. It was Sherry, and my adrenaline kicked in when I realized it was her. "Oh, to the rescue! And you're out too. There's no pause button in Manhunt." Todd spat off to the side at the ground and ran off the direction of cracking bushes in the distance. "Fine. You're such a skilled seeker, loser." She turned toward me and lightly shook her head. "Let's go, Julian." I was shocked that Sherry paid any attention to the situation in general and stammered when trying to speak to her. "Thanks for coming in when you did back there." She sat on the ground next to the tangled bikes and folded her legs up Indian style. "You're a big boy. You can stand up for yourself. Todd's just a prick and needs to be reminded at times." I laughed and immediately took notice that Tony was running up to join us, beaming his flashlight in our direction. "I was wondering if you were going to flake out again, but obviously I was mistaken. I wonder why." I snapped my head quickly off to the side, then back in his direction. "Okay, Dick." He smirked and turned his attention to Sherry. "Hello, lady. Looks like you too fell victim to Todd's resolve." Sherry glanced at Tony and fired back immediately. "Save it, Tony. Where's Mr. Tough Ass?" Tony pointed off into the woods. "Hunting the last two survivors. In fact, I see his beam now, and it looks like the others are with him. Typical." The others joined us as we all began to go over the situations we were caught in that led to our downfalls, and patiently waited for Todd's return, but something felt off. Normally Todd would have been the first to return to bask in his glory, but it was dead silent out in the woods. Tony was the first to realize he hadn't returned yet. What the hell is the holdup? Suddenly, a rush of branches began to smash and crash from something charging from the tree line and lunged out, tackling me to the floor. It was Todd. "What the hell, dude?" I yelled in my embarrassment. "Grow some balls, pansy," he replied as he laughed while rolling to his feet. "Go to hell, Todd." He looked at me with a mischievous stare. "Did I hurt your feelings, bro? Think you're a tough guy all of a sudden? Do something, Juliet. Prove me wrong." Tony chimed in at my side. "Chill, bro." Tony placed his hand on Todd's shoulder, and Todd instantly recoiled away from the calming gesture, turning his body in my direction and stepping toward me with a hostile demeanor. "Take the walk, then, tough ass." Sherry suddenly hopped into the conversation to try to ease the situation, but I wasn't having Todd calling me out in front of everyone without me accepting the challenge. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction and couldn't stomach looking like a fool in front of her for the third time. He knew it too. "Fine. You're on." I stormed off into the woods filled with so much anger and determination. Spotting a straight branch off of the first tree that I came across, I snapped off the branch, broke off all the stems and twigs, removed my hoodie and undershirt, then proceeded to tie the shirt to the top of the branch. Everyone began to surge with excitement as I pulled my hoodie back over my head. No one had taken a walk since Todd, a few weeks back when he swept out into the darkness with his branch, sporting his favorite red shirt. "You two are being ridiculous," Sherry spoke loudly from behind the group, and everyone quieted down. Todd glared in her direction and couldn't wait to open his mouth. "He's a chump. He wouldn't make it anywhere near my flag. I placed it so far out there, no one could ever beat my record." "Watch me," I snapped back. Todd quickly redirected his sight to me and began to chuckle. He then made sure to remind me of the ground rules. "No flashlight and no retreats. You come back at all, your attempt is forfeit, and you're not eligible for a retry until next week, so we can all relish in your failure, Juliana." I turned toward the entrance to the pit and began my journey. I just had no clue what I was truthfully getting myself into. Setting off into the darkness, the path began to show signs of rotten shrubbery, and dark soil was prevalent, like the trail was spoiling. I immediately began to regret my decision, but I continued to walk forward, trying to keep my composure as the crew's flashlight beams faded between the tree's thick branches. Every step I took was loud, and cracks of branches sounded off with every snap. I then realized how alone I was in that very moment. As I proceeded to walk, it took about 2 minutes before the first flag became visible. It was an eerie sight. Seeing the first flag that started everything. It was Dustin's. Dustin was the original creator of the walk, but Dustin moved away a couple of years back when his parents decided to leave this town behind them. About 10 feet ahead of his flag was Thomas's flag. Thomas was the youngest of the entire group, but one of the bravest of us all. He was the first to challenge Dustin's flag and truly set the entire trial sense of everything in motion, if you ask me. I had to walk another 20 feet out before I came across Tony's flag. His flag held strong to the lead flag title for a while, a couple of years back. He was the talk of the group for quite a bit, and kids spoke about him often. He was very humble about the attention, so it was easy to respect his status within the crew. As I continued to walk through the rotten path, about 8 feet ahead was Henry's flag. As soon as my eyes fixated on the strands of his faded shirt, my heart began to surge. All I could think about was the day when we all found the remains of his dog, and my mind started to fight my body. I paused for a moment, staring at the weathered threads in motion as they dangled. Shaken to the core, I began to frantically twist my sight about in all directions, fearing something was going to lash out at me from the forest. Get it together, Julian, I whispered to myself to try and establish any amount of courage I could muster. Top Todd's flag. It's just a walk. Top Todd's flag, I muttered as I slowly continued to walk. Suddenly, off in the distance ahead, I began to hear tree branches cracking from a deep area within the forest, struggling to hide the sounds of my heavy breathing from the rush of fright that struck my bloodstream. The cracking sounds halted about 30 feet ahead, but I couldn't see a damn thing too far in front of me with no flashlight and only the flickering glimpses I could make out from the pale moonlight streaming through the wind-driven treetops. A large gust blew directly down the path into my face. It was cold and had such a strange odor. I smelled that stench before, and it reminded me of roadkill. Nothing in that moment felt right. I closed my eyes and began to breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth. It was harsh. So I lifted my arm to cover my face with the inside of my elbow, attempting to battle the sour taste from saturating my tongue. My eyes began to tear, and my body began to shiver periodically. With my spirit bent to the point of breaking, I thought of running back, ready to accept defeat. But then the thought of Sherry, witnessing me fail again, seeped into my conscience. I couldn't allow myself to look like a fool again. Little did I know how ironic that thought was now, in hindsight. I continued to walk down the path while my heart refused to remain calm. I knew the rules, but no one was there, so I made the decision to forego the flashlight rule and tore my mag light from my front hoodie pocket. My body began to tremble so hard that it was nearly impossible for me to hold my flashlight steady, rattling the batteries inside of the handle as the beam of light danced out of control in any direction that I illuminated. There was no sign of Todd's flag ahead, but I recalled him stating that he placed his flag so far in, no one could ever top it. This is bullshit. Why the fuck did I put myself through this? A large clatter echoed through the forest, and I spun around to make sure nothing was behind me. Stopping again, I listened to the echo fade while barely able to control the volume of my breathing again. When I turned to continue onward, I found that I was face to face with another person. I stumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet, but caught myself before I completely lost my balance. When I pointed the beam into the figure's face, I could see that it was Charlie again. His sad expression was fixated on his hands, and there were tears streaming down his face. "What the hell are you doing out here, Charlie?" He continued to sob while staring at his hands. I stood there frightened, waiting for his response, but he seemed to be completely lost in his train of thought as his eyes bounced back and forth, staring at his fingers while he slowly moved them about. It was at that time that I realized his hands were completely covered in fresh blood. My heart began to race even faster, reminding me to take a large, slow inhalation to attempt to catch my breath from the shocked state. "What the hell is going on now?" I spoke aloud, more so to myself in disbelief, but Charlie quickly looked up at me and abruptly regained his composure while fixing his glazed eyes into mine. "It won't take me." "What?" "It wants me to live with that night forever." "What the fuck are you talking about, Charlie?" Sensing the extreme amount of tension, I took an extra step backward to place a little bit more space between myself and the possibility of an attack. Switching the flashlight around in my hand, I raised the torch to the side of my head, pointing the beam into Charlie's chest as to not blind my vision, or his vision for that matter, while allowing me the opportunity to strike at him with the butt end of the mag light if I had to. "You have blood on your hands, Charlie." He looked at me with pure sadness. "Yes. Yes, I do. In more ways than you could ever understand. I will live with the decision that I made for the rest of my life, and I am too weak to end it on my own." "What are you talking about? What did you do, Charlie?" He emotionally broke, and tears began to rush down his cheeks again. His eyes widened as he seemed to shake in panic, touching his fingers to his lips, then realizing that his hands were covered with blood once more. "Did you hurt someone?" Charlie quickly gazed back into my eyes. "No. But all of my pain is my own doing. My son is gone because of me. Charlie, you are scaring the shit out of me, bro. Everyone is waiting for me to return, and someone will report me missing. You stay in these woods for too long, and you will go missing, boy. So run. Run along. Run home before you catch sight of what lurks down in that wind." Charlie raised his arm to my face and patted me on the top of the head while staring into my eyes without a single blink. Then turned his attention toward the path leading out and began to stumble off into the darkness. I stood there shaking, listening to him snap through the path in a sporadic manner until I couldn't hear his steps any longer. The thread of my mind was now gone, but my conscience was completely shot. But so determined to plant my flag past Todd's, I took off, and I shook off Charlie's warning in my ignorance and continued onward in hopes of quickly finding the flag and bringing an end to this chaotic journey. As I continued down the path, I began to feel waves of anxiety course through my chest with anticipation and started to pick up my pace as I moved forward, hoping to reach the marker faster. My anxiety quickly transformed into panic, and I ran with no care for how loud I was traveling. By the time I was at full speed, the trail disappeared from under my feet, and the ground sharply gave way to a 3-foot descent, throwing me completely off balance as I crashed through thorn bushes while my body limply crumbled into a downward hillside. Crashing through the shrubs as I violently rolled like a cumbersome rag doll, my body flailed all around and then came to a jarring halt when my back slammed into a deeply rooted tree at the bottom of the descent. The path was gone. There wasn't any flag at all. Todd never planted a flag. That fucking lying sack of shit probably never even took the walk. It was hard for me to get my sense of direction, but I felt that I had to climb out of the cavity that I had fallen into from some point, but the bushes leading back to the top were laced with thick thorns, and every attempt to entertain tackling the ascent was met by serrated tangles and sharp jolts of pain. I continued to walk the perimeter and found that I was indeed encapsulated in a large area surrounded by these sharp walls, and quickly came to the realization that the entire area was void of any amount of life. The ground itself seemed to be comprised of ash, and that foul stench of death still heavily permeated from within the darkness. Suddenly, a large thumping sound like that of a falling tree shook the entire ground, like something fell from a large height and collided with the lifeless ground below it, diverting my attention toward whatever lurked in the darkness. From the dark haze, a long, low, animalistic grunt echoed around the surrounding clearing, allowing my thoughts to properly calculate just how large the void was. I had no clue what the hell the creature could possibly be that was making those horrific sounds, but hearing the direction it was coming from gave me the opportunity to catch my bearings and break off in the opposite direction of its soul-curdling bellow. The ground was trembling with every step that the creature was taking, and vibrations were throwing off my balance as I darted for my life. The cries in pursuit of me seemed to be coming from the sky, and quickly transformed into a blend of witch-like shrieks. I continued to run along the brush line in search of any gap that I could seemingly find, but found the entire perimeter was dangerously jagged. At that point, finding that I had no choice, I dove into the thorns and completely pushed all of my pain aside in my mind as barbs of razor-like thorns tore my clothing and shredded through my flesh like tissue paper. I had no gloves, but had no other choice but to grasp at the vines and branches ahead of me as I continued to rip through the brush for my life. My hands were soaked with fresh wounds that were gaping, open, streaming blood all the way down my forearms. I looked back to see humongous deer-like horns thrashing about through the vines behind me, accompanied by shrieking animalistic howls of pain, and I quickly made the assumption that the creature had to be what the town folk would speak about at the diner. I couldn't believe it was real. To this day, I still struggle to even comprehend how something so demonic could possibly exist. As I reached the top of the descent, Charlie was there waiting for me. He grabbed my numb, blood-soaked hand and hooked his forearm under my left armpit, tearing me through the remaining brush. He dragged me away from the edge and then quickly began to lift me to my knees. I caught my balance while stumbling to my feet, and when I looked back, I was startled to see that the creature's large skeleton hand smashed the top of the descent's edge, sending a shockwave through the ground as the beast slowly lifted its horrific eyes into sight. As its entire head came into view, it shrieked out a long, blood-curdling cry without breaking its sight from my eyes, freezing my soul in its tracks. It was so horrific and reminiscent of a rotten deer carcass, freshly animated and at least 3 times the normal size of any buck that I had ever encountered. Charlie yanked me out of my frozen state, pulling me toward the direction of the tree line. While we ran, he began to cheer me on as we fled for safety.
Run, son! Run like your soul depends on you!
We fled as fast as we could, but the trembling of the ground quickly transformed into tremors as the creature overtook us within seconds. Charlie thrusted me forward with all of his might, sending me staggering, but I was able to catch myself from falling, and when I turned back, I witnessed the creature latch onto Charlie and lift his entire body about 6 feet into the air, and then gruesomely tear his torso from his legs with the most disgusting wet sounds as his entrails spilled onto the floor into a pile of steaming remains. I turned back around and staggered off completely in shock, but snapped out of my lost mindset when I noticed that there were beams of light moving forward toward my direction at the end of the tree line, and I heard everyone screaming for me to run as fast as I could. The entire group was screaming so loudly in fear for my life from hearing the creature in pursuit, but they had no clue what was actually coming their way. It was at that moment that my adrenaline rushed back through my entire soul, and I took off toward my friends as fast as I could, like a bolt of lightning.
No! Run! Get out of the woods!
I saw all of their lights turn around as they all darted to escape without seeing the horrors that I had witnessed. When I reached the end of the tree line, I continued to run as fast as I could toward the pile of bikes as everyone was frantically untangling the mangled mess. And that's when I heard Sherry scream at the top of her lungs. When I looked back, I saw the beast ravenously tearing at the tree line, grasping at the trunks and violently shaking the timbers until they bowed and snapped. Its horrific sounds lashed out chaotic waves of anxiety through my chest, and I was immediately thrusted into uncontrollable sobbing. I have never been more frightened in my entire life. Just as fast as the creature was pursuing us, it quickly receded into the darkness, and the entire woods immediately became silent. The most haunting sound that I will take away from that night is when we all stood there and could only hear the wind blowing through the treetops, as if the creature was never there. I wasn't stupid. I knew it was right there, watching us, remembering us, wanting us. For whatever reason, it was unable to break the tree line, and for whatever reason, it has been there for quite a while. Some of us stood there listening, while others scattered away as fast as they could. Todd, Sherry, and Tony stood alongside of me for a moment, trying to listen for any signs of the creature. Tony broke the silence with a chattering, airy whisper. What the hell was that? Haley's monster. No shit. No shit. Sherry hooked her arm around my elbow and pulled me into her for some form of comfort. But to be honest, it was far more comforting to my nerves than I wanted to lead on to. I had to release my emotions somehow, and couldn't hold back the trembling from within my chest as I decided to bring a sense of closure to the remainder of that night. Your flag wasn't there. It wasn't there. Todd didn't break his frightened gaze from the woods. You never took that walk. I'm sorry. I heard things. Before, I mean, the stories. But never in my wildest. Charlie Harding is gone now because of a fucking dare. Your lie. What? Todd replied with a puzzled expression. He saved me in there, and he's gone now. Sherry broke into the conversation. We have to go to the police. Tony quickly spoke up. And say what? We were attacked by a fucking monster? We would all be locked down for an eternity. Todd quickly agreed. Sherry immediately began to fight for the proper thing to do, but I interrupted her speech. They're right. None of the others stayed around long enough to witness what we saw. I knew Charlie's story. He got what he wanted. It knows that we play near this tree line now, so we can't come back here. Sherry took notice of the deep lacerations and crimson stains soaked into my hands. We have to get you home, Julian. You are bleeding very badly. Strangely enough, my hands began to throb after she brought up the matter to my attention. Yeah, we all jumped onto our bikes and immediately started dashing away from the pit, and my adrenaline was rushing through my body as if we were still being chased by the creature, but nothing followed us. From that night forward, Sherry and we became inseparable. I will never forget Charlie. I will never forget everything that man put himself through to make sure that he didn't make the same mistake twice. And in my eyes, he redeemed himself. And I pray that he has found closure in the afterlife that he could not find amongst the living in the end. I still have Charlie's coin that he left at the diner that day. And every time I look at it, I see his face. Todd has completely humbled himself and admitted to everyone in the group that he never actually took that walk. No one has ever attempted again, for that matter. Tony spends every minute of his life reminding us all of that night, though, and swears that it will remain a mainstay as part of the folklore that has permanently grasped our little town. But my story continues to whisper through the hallways at school, and I have gained a slight amount of celebrity amongst the believers. Every now and then, a non-believer decides to speak out and call my bluff, but I always get the last word. Then, take the walk. I hope tonight's story quenched everyone's thirst for a devilish tale. Though that was one tale down a trail that I would tend to stay away from. It's amazing how many times that we find ourselves trapped in situations that we initially feel that we can't climb out of, but as soon as we are pushed to the absolute vertical limit, we tend to find the determination to conquer the situation that we initially believed to be insurmountable. I believe we can all learn a little something from this tale, but I believe it would be best to keep oneself as far from devils and demons as possible, for your eternal sakes. With that being said, I hope you look forward to hearing my next webisode that will be dropping, reviewing Rob Zombie's remake of Halloween, that I am currently scheduled to deliberate with my own consciousness on as to where the title sits in the ranks of horror movie remakes. The people have voted, and I am up for the challenge. Keep your eyes peeled, and continue to remain aware. But until then, stay safe, sleep well, and keep your wits